Hey, this is Jacob Bender, Executive Director of CAIR Philadelphia, in a webinar panel discussion about the importance and significance of hip-hop culture within the African American community. My guest today, of course, is our own hip-hop artist and legal mind and attorney, Timothy Welbeck, who is our civil rights attorney here at CAIR Philadelphia. Good morning, Tim.
Good morning, Jacob. How are you?
Good, very good. Quarantine as usual.
Yes, quarantined as usual.
So today's program is about hip hop culture. Now, I know that you teach a class at that in Temple
Yes.
University. Is that at the law school or just the general population?
I teach in the undergraduate part of Temple. I teach in the College of Liberal Arts. I actually teach two hip hop courses. I teach one hip hop course entitled Hip Hop and Black Culture. It's in the Department of Africology and African American Studies. And additionally, I teach a class called No City for Young Men, Hip Hop and the Narrative of Marginalization. And that's in the Department of Geography and Urban Studies.
And were these courses your ideas, or did the administration come to you and say that we would like to do a course on hip hop culture?
Hip Hop and Black Culture was a course already in existence before I began teaching it. No City for Young Men is a course that I developed and created. So I can tell you what we do in each course, if that helps.
Sure.
So Hip Hop and Black Culture is a course, after, as its name would suggest, is examining hip hop and its origins and its role within Black culture. We do three primary things. We look at hip hop as an African-derived aesthetic. We look at hip hop history, and we look at hip hop as a microcosm of the Black experience. And so with that, the course is functionally divided into thirds. The first, looking at hip hop retaining and evolving traditional West African forms of music making and cultural expressions. Then the second third, we look at hip hop history, beginning in the early 1970s, and I usually stop around the 90s just for the sake of time. And then the last, we do topical discussion. So we'll talk about hip hop's response to police brutality, hip hop's portrayal of women, hip hop and expressions of faith, hip hop's response to racial disparities in the criminal justice system, hip hop and cultural appropriation, things of that nature. And then No City for Young Men examines how hip hop communicates the lived experiences of people living in urban America.
So for the uninitiated, primarily among white folks, could you give a brief definition of hip hop culture and sort of when did it start, and how did it start as well?
So hip hop is a cultural expression that participates in the continuum of Black music in America. At its origins, it had four primary cultural elements: emceeing, DJing, breakdancing, and graffiti. It has since grown on and evolved to the point that it can exist in legitimate and authentic ways without necessarily having all four of those elements present at the time. In terms of how it started, the conventional answer is that Kool Herc, his real name was Clive Campbell, him and his sister threw a party on August 11th, 1973. And it was a back to school jam. It was somewhat held impromptu, but at that party, what Kool Herc, the DJ, did was something really novel in that he was trying to pull the breakbeat out of certain records rather than playing the record in their entirety. A breakbeat is simply the solo of the rhythm section. So like when James Brown says, "Let the drummer get some," and Funky Drummer, and Clive Stubblefield goes on a solo, that became the breakbeat of that song. So what Kool Herc noticed was that was people's favorite parts of songs. So rather than just playing the song in its entirety, what he ended up doing was trying to go from that portion of the song, the solo of the rhythm section, to the next solo of the rhythm section of another record. And he had two turntables, and he would go from record to record doing that. And in so doing, he inadvertently created the instrumental sound bed that formed the foundation of hip hop music. And so he called that technique the merry-go-round technique. But it really, by most scholars' assertions, is the formal introduction of hip hop music in the United States. But for, I guess, in a larger view, what I say is that hip hop didn't fall out of the sky 45 years ago, or 47 years ago, but more precisely, the hip hop, it participates in a family tree of Black music. And so in the same way that I have ancestors and you have ancestors, hip hop has ancestors too. And they share features and history, things like that.
And from the beginning, was there sort of a competition between East Coast and West Coast, between Harlem and Compton?
That was not an initial thing. So when hip hop first emerged, it was an obscure cultural phenomenon that was happening purely in the 7 Mile Island of the Bronx. And it really stayed relegated to the Bronx for much of its early history. From about 1973 until 1979, you really were only experiencing hip hop in real and legitimate ways if you found your way to the Bronx, or you maybe had stumbled into a random club here and there in Manhattan that might have experimented with it. And what is said to have introduced hip hop to the world of Sugar Hill Gang's Rapper's Delight. And so the story behind that song is that Sylvia Rhone saw a rapping DJ at a birthday party, and she said, "This is the next thing that I want to do." Her record label was primarily doing disco, and she knew that it was time to launch into the next thing. And so she's scouring the Bronx looking for rappers. She couldn't get anyone's attention. And her son, by chance, happens to meet Wonder Mike and Hank Williams, who became 2/3 of the Sugar Hill Gang. And so they form a group, they make a song, they put it out, and it goes viral before going viral was a thing. And so that's what really began spreading hip hop outside of the Bronx. But the whole East Coast, West Coast thing wasn't really something that was a significant, I guess, point of inquiry until the mid to late 90s. And even then, it was a kind of over-manufactured media narrative that was happening that was really advancing the personal squabbles between the two biggest rappers at the time, Biggie and Tupac. But prior to that, hip hop was beginning to emerge in unique and profound ways in different regional outlets, but there wasn't necessarily acrimony between hip hop in Compton and hip hop in New York or hip hop in Texas. I mean, by the time some of those outlets started getting more attention in the mid to late 90s, some New Yorkers would sometimes have an elitist attitude and say, this isn't as legitimate as ours, but it wasn't as though it was acrimonious in a way as like, we want to fight you for making your music, so sort of thing.
Part of my impression came from the film Out of Compton.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you feel that's, from what I hear you saying, that's not a rather accurate portrayal and a more of a Hollywoodization of the story of Ice Cube and his friends.
So they helped launch the sound of the West Coast, the NWA that is. And so they were instrumental in that way. And they were controversial, they were polarizing because of their name and some of their content. And some people in New York didn't get their slang and things like that. So, I mean, there was some tension, but I think that some of it has been overblown, particularly in hindsight. What I will say, though, is that the film itself, Straight Outta Compton, for the sake of Hollywood, was pretty true to the story of NWA. There were some omissions here and there, but for the most part, Hollywood did a fair job of capturing that story well.
In the last 3 or 4 weeks, we've seen a outpouring of Black Lives Matter and protest against the widespread police brutality in the Black community. And hip hop seems to be a component of that liberation struggle from
Yes.
the beginning of the movement in Ferguson, even going much farther back to earlier forms of protest.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how that combination, how that melding of hip hop with Black liberation struggle took place in your estimation.
Hip hop is uniquely poised to challenge police brutality and state-sanctioned violence in ways that few other things are. And what I mean by that is when you consider that hip hop emerged in a deindustrialized South Bronx in a nation, in a city that was devastated by failed urban policies and people were left to live in squalor, that hip hop emerged out of that reality. And some of the earliest hip hop from that area was critiquing that. If you look at Grandmaster Flash's and the Furious Five's The Message, they're talking about what it means to live there. And so hip hop then has and continues to reflect and critique much of the world in which it emerges out of. And so you can see as early as 1988 with NWA's infamous song about the police, they're talking about what it means to be accosted and to be abused and to be subject to excessive uses of force by the police in their area. And NWA came out 2 years after that song was popular and said they felt vindicated when the Rodney King footage emerged, because they said what happened to Rodney King is exactly what we talked about in this song. If you listen to the first lyrics, Ice Cube says, F the police coming straight from the underground. A young, you know what, has it bad because I'm brown. That's how he starts off the song. And he's saying that we have this antagonistic relationship with the police, not because we began it, but because the police are in our neighborhoods. They're accosting us. They're killing us. They're subjecting us to all sorts of violence, and we have no recourse. So at the very least, we're going to talk about it. And so there's a long tradition of that emerging from that. Every era since then has had a major hip hop song decrying state-sanctioned violence as it manifests in police brutality. And we've seen even in this, I guess, post-Ferguson Black Lives Matter form of activism, hip hop artists have been directly involved, not only in protest, but in making protest music. Kendrick Lamar's song, All Right, has become a protest chant. J. Cole is regularly seen protesting right alongside of everyday citizens. Talib Kweli, Killer Mike, Mayamina Youssef, Lecrae, Toby and Wigway, these are people who are seen on the streets in their respective cities. Trey the Truth, these are people who are in their cities marching alongside people because they're saying that we're a part of this community. And so it makes perfect sense that rappers would be a part of this and that their music would be the soundtrack for a lot of it too.
Timothy, if you could also talk about how hip hop as a protest movement music ties into our work at CAIR, which we are in a way a protest movement itself, protesting Islamophobia and white supremacy and trying to connect the struggle of protection of American Muslims to the struggle to protect the rights of all people in the United States?
Yeah, that's a great question. So hip hop has always, like we just discussed, had this revolutionary bent or this participation in this broader continuum of the struggle for equality and liberty, particularly in marginalized communities. So in some ways, it's a soundtrack to the work that we do. And then and then I guess in a closer way, much of the themes that you find in some of the work of some of hip hop's most celebrated acts is some of the work that we do every day. This work of championing the cause of liberty, fighting for freedom, calling out injustice, calling out white supremacy and other forms of systems that disenfranchise people. Hip hop in many ways has done that for decades. That's the work that we're doing right now. And so you have some artists who are directly working in tandem with their communities to bring about those types of changes. I think about artists like Rhapsody, who's been very involved in some of the efforts for police brutality and also bringing about justice for some of the people who've recently been killed. I think about Jaziri X, who's based in Pittsburgh, who's a part of the activist community. I myself am an artist, and there are a host of others who find meaningful ways to engage in their communities, and that's much of what we do every day at CAIR.
Coincidentally, as we're recording this for future broadcast, last night my family and I watched the movie 13. And it's a wonderful film, and I was struck by how the director brought in, hip hop music and computer graphics to augment the documentary feel of the film as well. And it was an interesting connection director chose.
Absolutely. Ava Duvernay fully understands what we're talking about right here. And I think that's one of the key insights that she had in making the film. Just by way of discussing 13th, for those who haven't seen it, I consider it to be the most important film that's been released in the last 10 to 15 years. It's a documentary about mass incarceration in the United States. It's a Netflix original directed by Ava Duvernay, and it's drawing a straight line from the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the creation of the prison industrial complex. And it hinges on this idea that there's a caveat in the middle of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment of a crime whereof the party has been duly convicted shall exist within the United States or any place subject to its jurisdiction. That caveat in the middle, except as punishment of a crime whereof the party has been duly convicted, allows for slavery to persist. This idea of involuntary servitude, it can exist within the confines of prisons. And so we've talked about that earlier, but it's worth noting that we see this happening every day right now. Private corporations using prison labor to sell items in the open market. We see prisoners in California literally fighting fires for about $1 a day. And then when they leave prison, if they're able to leave prison, they can't get a job in California because they have a record. We see that every day. And so Ava Duvernay's documentary walks through that and draws a straight line from the end of slavery through the modern prison industrial complex. And with that, the soundtrack of that is hip hop. You'll hear songs from T.I., you'll hear songs from Chuck D, you hear songs from Dead Prez, you hear songs from Killer Mike. All of these are artists throughout the span of history, both past and present in hip hop, who've used their music as a form of activism. And so it was an appropriate choice by Ava Duvernay to do something like that.
One of the impressions from outside the African American community is that hip hop is by its nature violent and misogynist and generally profane. How do you respond to that, particularly lyrics, that talk about subjugation of women by men?
So my answer to that is multifaceted. I'll begin by saying that hip hop and my old car have much in common. Both make a lot of noise and both are vehicles. And so hip hop in and of itself isn't inherently good or bad. It's about how in which it's used. And so it's a vehicle, it's a cultural expression that can transmit and transport ideas. And so then it's about how the artist is using it. The second thing I'll say is that hip hop is replete with artists whose material and content is uplifting and affirming and showcasing the beauties and the dimensions of all humanity. And so if you're looking for that, you will find it. There are artists past and present who fit that description, everyone from Toby and Wigway to Common to Talib Kweli, Yasin Bey, Lauryn Hill. There are people whose content is affirming and uplifting, and many people would find worthy of celebrating. Conversely, I guess my third point would be there is this undercurrent of mainstream corporate-sponsored hip-hop that over the span of the last 3 decades has been violent and misogynistic and degrading of women. There is a large swath of hip-hop that falls along those lines. My explanation for that is that much of that type of content originated from people who were trying to talk about the living conditions that they were in were profane. So then their music then was profane because they were describing profane conditions. What then happened is that type of content emerged at the same time that a significant number of labels and corporations were entering into the culture. They found that to be commercially viable. So then they started promoting that type of content. And then when you look up, that's the type of content that's promoted and advanced. And then people want to imitate that because they believe that's what needs to happen in order to get a platform. So there has been a wide array of people who have fallen along those lines and made the type of category. It is offensive. It should be critiqued. It should be challenged. And there's no shortage of people who do that as cultural commentators, as listeners, and as artists themselves.
Very good. As many forms of Black culture throughout the history of the United States, the white establishment has looked down upon it as of a lesser artistic and cultural value, not up to the high standards of Western music or literature or poetry.
Yeah.
And do you see that reckoning with the white establishment as just another example of white supremacy, or was there
Absolutely.
something
Absolutely.
different?
Absolutely. So, I mean, just the framing in and of itself is just inherently like founded upon the notion of white supremacy to call a particular form of music, Baroque music from a particular period of time, from a particular region of Europe, and say that that is classical music. That framing in and of itself is coming from a racist lens and saying that in the history of all people, we're going to use this as a framework by which we're going to look at all other music. And then to even know that Baroque music in many ways is coming from African instruments like the piano, the violin, and some of these French horns all have their roots in Africa. And so to say that these groups of people in Europe at this particular time made the standard of music and will compare everything else to it is a fundamentally flawed notion, but it's found its way into all forms of critique in the modern world. And so to that end, hip hop has been subject to that. When hip hop first emerged, people said it's not real music. They said there's no melody and people aren't really singing. You're not really playing an instrument. So how is this music? But what hip hop has gone on to prove for almost the last 5 decades is that it's dynamic, it's vibrant, it uses instrumentality and composition in new and unique ways. Sampling is just as artful form of composition as Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. To take an old record, to reimagine it, hear new rhythms and new melodies and new progressions in it, and then take that and mix it with something else and make something entirely new. It's a compositional element to it. And similarly,
I'm thinking particularly here of Bach's use of counterpoint and contrapuntal music.
yeah, absolutely.
Text that built upon the medieval church tropes and then taking it into more of a performance and a secular aspect as well.
Absolutely, that's a great way to look at it. And similarly speaking, so when Kanye West takes Shaka Khan's Through the Fire and then speeds up her vocals and pitches it up a little bit and then adds a new layer of drums, brings in a new layer of bass, and then makes Through the Wire his song, there's a compositional element in all of that. He had to be able to hear what the song eventually became in the original. And so he's taking pieces of it and rearranging it, adding new elements to it to make a new song. And so that's what's happening in a lot of hip hop production. And even if we're looking at some of the more, I guess, modern iterations of hip hop too, you have a significant use of melody, a significant manipulation of rhythm, and still you've got some of this dynamic ability to pull together ideas in ways that few other genres are able to communicate. I say that to say that, so the average, like maybe pop song may have about 8 lyrics in a verse, maybe 4 to 8 lines in a verse, because you're looking at trying to sing your verse in about 16 bars, so it's about 44 seconds. The average rap verse is going to put together about 12 to 16 lines with the same span of time. You're using more words, there's more lyrics, there's more opportunity to communicate. So I said all of that to say it's a great opportunity for music making, and it took a great amount of time for people to realize that.
I'm thinking of a different art form in terms of visual arts and the utilization of African masks by Picasso in the development of Cubism.
Yes.
To be seen most dramatically here in Philadelphia at the Barnes Museum, where
Yes.
Barnes put the masks directly next or hanged them next to Picasso's distortion of female figures and faces. And you can see the unbelievable influence that these African artists in traditional artistic forms had upon the emergence of Cubism in modern art in Europe?
That's a great segue just into cultural appropriation as a whole, just in that because the artists that inspired Picasso were first ignored, then reviled until they were ultimately imitated and then ignored all over again. So Picasso was heralded as his artistic genius, and the people that he was inspired by were at first completely erased from the narrative of his creation of art. And that trend has found its way into almost all forms of Black music in the United States. Almost any form of Black music first is ignored by the white populace. Then, once it starts to get some attention, is reviled because you're looking at it through this framework of it's not fitting into Eurocentric norms of music making. And then it's ultimately imitated and appropriated. And so you can look at Paul Whiteman, who was considered the king of jazz at one point, or you can look at Elvis Presley, who was considered the king of rock at one point, or you can look at Iggy Azalea and Macklemore, who were considered the king and queen of hip hop at one point. All of these types of things that happen at different stages in Black music making, and it's been this part of this larger trend of deriding Black culture until it can be profited from, and then once it's profited from, the people who made it are handled like merchandise and then discarded when they're not useful anymore.
Now, what about the issue of white kids doing rap? How has that been perceived in the Black community? Obviously, Eminem comes to forefront as one of the more prominent people, white artists who have taken this art form onto themselves. How is he perceived, and how is in general white people doing rap music perceived within the African American community? And I'm sure there's not just one view, but a range of views.
There are a range of views, but in a general sense, the Black community and Black art is welcoming of all people. What you'll notice is that these spaces generally are a haven for anyone who is embracing of the culture. And so, much to the chagrin of some purists, sometimes people who should not are deemed, I guess, unworthy or just unfitting for the culture are welcomed in anyway. I said that to say, like, hip hop has always had, not always, but hip hop has had white people coming in and performing hip hop. But there's a difference between an Eminem and a Vanilla Ice, or between a Mac Miller and a Post Malone. What I mean by that is when you come in and you talk about this idea of I'm embracing the culture, I'm celebrating for who it is, I'm honoring the people that came before me and naming them, participating in the culture authentically and being true to myself, you can be welcomed. That's why Eminem is widely considered one of the greatest rappers of all time, and almost no one calls him a cultural appropriator. Eminem will tell you that he's benefited from being a white man in a Black space, and that's helped his sales, but very few people will say he's an appropriator, because people understand that he understands the culture, he values the culture, he participates in it authentically. Someone like an Iggy Azalea, who comes in and, like, when you hear her speaking regularly, she speaks the King's English, but then when she raps, she takes on this disingenuous Black scent that people have said. She is talking about things that are foreign to her, literally and figuratively. And she seems to be making a mockery of the culture as a whole. There are people who had great issue with her, especially when she talked about disrespecting pioneers in the culture and not honoring where hip hop came from. So I said that to say hip hop is welcoming of white people to participate in it in a general sense. Eminem, Mac Miller, Beastie Boys, these are some of hip hop's greatest names, and they have vast followings. They're beloved because they understood the culture, they embraced it, and they celebrated it. Eminem, anytime you ask him, will be quick to tell you that he was influenced by Redman and X-Clan and Tretch from Naughty by Nature and a list of other people. He doesn't act like he invented what he did. And so I said that to say, so Eminem is an example of people feel like he's done well by the culture.
Timothy, hip hop began as an American art form, and in the same way as jazz and motion pictures and Broadway were uniquely American art forms. But in the past decade, if not more, hip hop has become internationalized. It has spread around the world. How do you see the internationalization of hip hop? How did this American art form went off and in a way culturally conquered the world? And on the other hand, is there some objection from hip hop artists in the United States who feel that their art form is being taken away from them, has been appropriated by non-African Americans?
So hip hop is ubiquitous, as you said. There are places without running water and electricity that hip hop is touched. And a lot of that began with the global spread of the music, beginning with hip hop beginning to touch radio and television. Jeff Chang's Can't Stop, Won't Stop talks about how the film Wild Style, which basically documents a lot of early hip hop culture, was released in 1983. When that movie was released, they did a tour to promote it. And one of the places they went is Japan. And many of the people who were involved in the film went to Japan to demonstrate hip hop culture, because one of the things that film did well was many of the people who were prominent in early hip hop in the Bronx were in the film. So some of these pioneers are in the film. They go to Japan. And Jeff Chang said within a week of them being there, people were breakdancing, they were spray painting, and were beginning to rap. And it just shows the ways in which hip hop can spread and spread quickly. For some of the reasons I mentioned earlier, you don't necessarily need to be able to play a traditional instrument. You don't necessarily need to be able to sing. But if you can control and manipulate rhythm, if you can rap, if you can learn how to use a turntable, you can make music in many compelling ways. And hip hop's international growth and expansion, for the most part, is celebrated among many people within the culture because it shows the global reach and also the power of the culture. And then also there are many acts in hip hop whose prime and in terms of popularity has since passed, but they can still tour regularly overseas in places like Western Europe and Australia, parts of West Africa, things like that.
And to show the power of hip hop in the internationalization of hip hop and how this uniquely American art form has been utilized by resistance and protest movements around the world. There's one example that I really like, which is the song El Kafia Arabia. The kafia is the Arab scarf worn in Palestine as a sign of resistance to Israeli occupation. The artist is Shadia Mansour.
Yeah, that's a great example, and there's a litany of examples across the globe of protest movements, resistance movements embracing hip hop, because hip hop from its inception has been a voice of the voiceless. This idea of people who are relegated to the least desirable part of the Bronx. The Bronx was a wasteland, and it's from there hip hop emerges as this outcry of people who are left in this wasteland, so to speak. That's what hip hop has represented from its inception. So it makes perfect sense that people in Syria, people in Palestine, people across the globe who have found themselves marginalized and disenfranchised have embraced hip hop in substantial ways and made it their own. And that's the beauty of the culture.
As a sort of amateur musician myself and a filmmaker, I remember as a young adult or late teenager, the first time that I was struck by my ability to be creative and to take music and pictures and put them together on film. And that urge stayed with me throughout my middle age and longer creative productions. And I'm wondering when was the first time that you felt this music coming inside of you, and that you yourself wanted to give creative voice to that rhythm, to that music, both because of its political content and both because of its artistic content?
So my story with that is interesting. So my parents' first introduction to hip hop was through Two Live Crew. And so for those who might be unfamiliar with Two Live Crew, their album that really launched them into national attention was this album called Nasty As I Want to Be. And you can use your imagination for what they're talking about. And so that album was banned in Florida because it was deemed to be obscene. And so the state's attorney general was enforcing that policy. You could be arrested, literally arrested, for selling that album. Luke Campbell, who was a lead member of that group, sued the state's attorney general in federal court, saying that I have a First Amendment right to be as nasty as I want to be, so to speak. As the controversy was bubbling, my mother asked a coworker, is the music as bad as people are saying it is? And my mom's coworker happened to have a copy of the album, and to show you how long ago this was, she brought a cassette to work the next day. Let my mom hear it. My mom heard it at lunch and on her lunch break, and she came home and told my father, this is what hip hop is. Timothy and Catherine can't listen to it. Catherine is my little sister. And so for years, I was really only listening to my parents' music, James Brown, Aretha Franklin, Marvin Gaye, the Clark sisters, things like that. And so when I was a teenager, one summer my cousin came to visit me, and while I was at school, she found a hip hop station, and I came home and she was listening to it. And I said, what is this? And I was just really struck by the music. I was captivated by it. I was drawn in. And she said, this is the hip hop station. I can't believe you didn't know. And so I spent the next 3 days with her, just falling in love with the music, listening to it, learning who was popular at the time, things like that. And then I retroactively started listening to the music that I had been ignoring all that time. And this is around the time my parents started giving me some autonomy with what I listened to. And within about 1.5 years of that, I started rapping myself. I had a friend who came to visit, and we were just hanging out, having a good time, and we just started rapping. And from there, I just basically started and never stopped. And so that's kind of how I got involved in the culture, so to speak.
And could you honor us with one of your raps?
Okay.
I'm thinking of the one you did on the webinar.
Oh, okay. I was going to do something completely different. I was not,
up to you.
I was not expecting to rap, but let me see. About protests and just kind of where we are right now. In the words of Jermaine, we just want to take off the chains. In the words of O'Shea, we want days without the AK. And in the words of Mr. Duckworth, if God's got us, we're going to be all right. We're going to be okay. These demagogues who strive, those who fight to conserve, believe our lives have worth before our wives are given birth. And we're at odds because the compromise they often devise, justify demise, or only make matters worse. These guys on the other side will land on equity without a deed conferred. My point, the power in office is with us in word. What I've learned, what I've come to observe is the left wing and the right wing belong to the same bird. That'll ruffle some feathers if you got some privilege incurred. They will muzzle the message. They think the system will work. But I believe I am not discouraged. I am not deterred. Whatever hues that color me, the language in the dream is not deferred. I serve the God who made heaven and earth, who hung the sun, moon, and stars, and he hears our concerns. And lo, he is faithful there to the end. So I believe that we will win.
Wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. As we wrap up, for our listeners out there, this has been Jacob Bender for CAIR Philadelphia, Council on American Islamic Relations, with our civil rights attorney, Timothy Welbeck, who has helped us understand a little bit more about the African-American experience today through its cultural creativity and cultural genius. Thank you, Timothy, for sharing with us, for opening up perhaps new views of culture among the Muslim community here in Philadelphia.
It was a pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity. I'm glad to have had this conversation and be happy to do it again.